Well, it did make me think, is there a new term in learning load?
Oh,
Have you
I
ever
say
heard that
learning.
before?
I say learning burden. I say learning burden all the
burden.
time to my people.
I don't like the word burden.
That's it.
Burden.
Why? Why don't you like that?
Oh, I don't know, because burden just seems like represents to
burden?
me a weight. Something. A load is like a fullness and a burden is a weight, which to me are two different things. And a burden is something that can shift. I don't know. I just don't like burden.
No, you're wrong. You're wrong about not liking it. You need to start liking it because it perfectly encapsulates.
It's a word that's used a lot. There was a research that was done by the universities into
She's always with the
burden
research.
there is, isn't there? In the clinical placements. And they started off just looking at the experience of clinical placement, and what they came out with this word of burden. And that's what triggers in me.
And if there's enough behind that word being a negative connotation, why even use it?
No,
I'm all for
so against. Oh God, I'm so against this. So.
Welcome back to the Capability Corner. This is the podcast where we explore what's happening in healthcare, workforce development and capability. We are talking all things capability. My name is Zoe Yule. I am Head of Community at AusMed, and I am joined by two brilliant people who you're going to hear a lot from today because I've got to preface this by my brain's not highly functioning right now, but pressure's on, ladies, because you're going to be at the top of your game today.
What's adorable is that you think we're going to pick up the load for you, but I'm not sure.
Michelle Wickie, Chief Customer Officer at AusMed, and Dr. Karen Patterson, our inaugural Chief Nursing Officer at AusMed. Welcome to you both. Tell us what's been going on in your world. Karen, what have you been doing this week? Apart from making your hair look absolutely stunning.
Gorgeous.
I'm still enjoying it.
Anyway, we'll go with the weather. The weather's done that. But I've been the absolute privilege, which other people probably don't think so, is to look at clinical governance in the context of AusMed and, the products and services that we deliver. And, from myself, from a background from working in government and clinical governance, it's been something that, I'm very used to having policies and practices and standards and, external audits and parts from there to looking at, what are the requirements of a private company. I was just blown away that, from a governance standards, it's really vague. And what I love about, the team and from AusMed and the parts from there is in saying, well, how do we hold we truly have to hold ourselves to account. The whole part about governance is an accountability framework and looking about transparency and responsibility and trust and credibility in the services that you provide. But having no one actually saying you have to do this and choosing to do it yourself and saying, okay, we recognise that we're delivering services to healthcare professionals who are then applying that knowledge to their practice and to the improving the health and lives of the greater community. We have to hold ourselves to account. So it's been, I'm one of those weird people who really enjoy sort of thinking about that and then, actually having the privilege to think about if you could design a governance framework, what would it look like and what would you include in it that could give you that sense of assurance that what you were delivering to this community is safe and is helping them to deliver the outcomes that, they want to.
I love it. Privilege is all ours. I'm excited to hear that you've gotten started in this new world, Karen, and it made me remember why we first went for ANCC accreditation. Accreditation with the American Nurses Credentialing Centres Commission. It is something that not many people in Australia know of, but we were on the internet one day, scrounging around thinking we've moved from publishing textbooks to making online content. And when we published books, we had very strict standards. You couldn't publish anything without dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And there was strict, editing and publishing standards. But there wasn't the same thing for making online content. So we found this ANCC accreditation and used it to say, all right, this is the bar. This is what good looks like. We think we're somewhere down here. Let's get up here. And lo and behold, about 4 years later, we got accreditation with distinction. We thought, oh, well, that's pretty good. Wow, great. Well, that's good. We'll keep on doing what we're doing. And then it honestly wasn't until about, 5 years after that, when we were at a conference in America, and there was a workshop run by the ANCC the day before, and we're in a room with all accredited providers, so other organizations across the world who have been accredited. And, it's the chief nurse of the Orthopedics Association of America and the Cardiology Nurses Society. And we're saying, well, we're from AusMed and we're accredited with distinction. Literally, people stood up and clapped. Like, Americans, they're so what, like,
adorable.
Everyone stands up and claps. But it was really, that was when we realized the significance of it. So that's been our sort of benchmark. But I think, ANCC versus the Karen Patterson designed model of clinical governance. Look out, world. This is
yeah. But I just think that's, again, a great example of, you sought that out because you knew it was the right thing to do, like the best thing to do, and provide that evidence. And even though no one asked you to do it or wanted you to do it or parts from there, so you're really setting the benchmark across the globe from there. And, being able to then get the trust of government or private or, for-profit, not-for-profit organisations to actually see the value from there. I just think that, I was reading around the work around Health Direct and how they utilise the AusMed resources and to support their clinicians in their decision-making and referral processes, and having access to that information via AusMed is, I think fantastic and a bit of a quiet achiever.
Oh, thanks, Kat. We've always been a little bit under the radar, but I feel like we're not so much under the radar anymore.
That was beautifully put. With this. I feel like we're not so much.
Interestingly, you mentioned Health Direct. I read this week that Health Direct is now going to become 1300 Medicare. Did you see that?
Yes, I did, and that was one of my thoughts, which inspired this conversation, because I was thinking, well, how cool is that? And that in the scheme of things, cool. that's a recognised service and, is obviously doing a fantastic job. One of the reasons it's doing a fantastic job is it's got the right infrastructure and support and knowledge feeding into its clinicians and providers and parts from there. So, and that's the loop back to having access, to credible, evidence-based, best practice education and resources that maintain the competence of the providers.
Yeah. So we will talk about competence, listeners. I can assure you we have a really interesting conversation about competence. But out of fairness and respect to you, Michelle, what are you up to this week? What's going on in your world?
What is going on? Oh, I'm in the AI space at the moment. You know that. Yeah. Talking about competent AI phone agents. And we've turned one on for AusMed, super exciting. But now I've just got to work on her being as competent as possible. But I had a little call with the provider, the vendor, and he said that I had done all my homework beautifully, better than anyone else, which is really interesting, Zoe, because you've never seen me do homework before or preparation, but I'd prepared.
It's the right motivation.
Imagine, yeah.
And then I even showed him how I was using Chappie to check the competence and the capability of my AI agent, and he was like, that's really good. And I was like, yeah. Because I was like, Chappie, can you please listen to this transcript and then tell me where the gaps are with my AI agent, and then what documents I should upload for my AI agent to be more capable and competent. And so then it, would tell me the documents. And so, that's what I've been working on this week. Competence of my AI agent.
Love it. Well, on that note, let's get our teeth stuck into competence.
I pulled that together, didn't I? Whew.
You did, yeah. We've gone round and round and round and round and round, but we got there.
Yeah.
The word gets thrown around a lot. It sounds straightforward, but I think it's honestly maybe one of the most misunderstood concepts. We just sort of say competence assessment. We're talking, we're saying, but I guess what I want to pick your brains about today is, what is it? What is competence? What does it actually mean?
I would agree it's everywhere and everything, because it's just used as a term sometimes that can be something that blocks people from being able to, contribute, and other times it's, well, if I've got this, then I'm allowed to do it as well. So it's an interesting, and there's lots of different definitions, but, competence I see as the integration of, the knowledge, skills and attributes. So it's not just it's not a single thing. It's about how that knowledge is understood and then enacted. And you use the word assessment as well. Competence is observable as well. So it's practicable. So being an applied science of healthcare, it is something that contributes to your practice and is something that can be broken down into parts that can be looked at, observed from there. So I would agree that my belief, and this isn't referencing anything from there, is that competence is the foundation, because it is, if we start with competence, that means we have a confidence that the person has the knowledge, skills and attributes and they can apply them. Then it's about building capability. Competence is the starting point. And then from a capability development, that's then the ability to adapt and adjust that. Yeah, they're building blocks. And so that's why I think
I
that's...
mentally saw competence, confidence, capability. But I am going to...
confidence in between capability and competence.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Where does confidence sit? Or where should it sit? And then where does compliance fit in? Just because, I love a bit of alliteration. And when you're saying competence is the foundation of capability, where does confidence and where does compliance fit in?
Look, off the top of my head, I'm going to say that confidence shouldn't, I'd like it to not sit in that scaffold at all, like some kind of parallel, because some people can be competent and still confident. Some people can be capable and capability and different levels of capability and still confident. And then some people could be all of those things and still not confident at all. I feel like it's just like it doesn't have to be a standard we meet. But I think confidence, if it's good and true and ethical and nice and lovely, then it's fine to be confident in any of those stages. But it's actually not a standard that I want any of my people aiming for necessarily. Yeah. I think it's just a nice to have if it's real and true.
You can be confidently incompetent as well. And that's when a lot of the time when things go wrong, is that the person didn't actually, they truly didn't. They were very confident in their incompetence. They didn't know.
Yes.
And that's about also that I think competence is part of a system. It's about the human and how they show up and interact and apply themselves. But it's also about the environment around them. So that's the part where someone feels safe to say, oh, that didn't, maybe we should, have a chat about, what's just happened here, or to say, I'm not actually sure what I'm doing here. I know all the bits, but how it comes together, I'm not really sure about. So having that environment of psychological safety in in the here and now, but also having that environment to reflect on and to talk with your peers and others about, insights or things that you hadn't expected, or things that went well or things that went terribly. So you can actually go, I thought I was really good at that, but it didn't work. I don't understand what went wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the other word you said, Zoe, was compliance. But I would argue the same. There can be compliance at any point because, weirdly enough, in some ways, maybe not all, maybe I can't think that fast, but in some ways, you could actually have a team that have not had any training, have not demonstrated their competence. Neither have they demonstrated their incompetence, right? But just haven't demonstrated, maybe haven't been assessed for their competence, and are still compliant. Things are still ticking along. Maybe the care they take in certain ways means that, the markers are all being marked off. So, and this one I'm a little bit shakier on, but I do think you could be compliant whether you're competent or maybe not incompetent, but whether your competence has been assessed or not. whether your team or your workforce are fully capable or not fully capable, sometimes a compliance can still occur. So I don't think I would say it's in the scaffold of competence and capability, but I'm really happy to hear someone argue back at me about that.
Well, the only part that I would say about compliance is I feel like it's a one-off, like it's
Single point in time?
Yeah, so that's what I think I hear you saying, Michelle, is that is like an audit. Like the compliance is an assessment, and it's a static.
Can I be the devil's advocate and say I agree? I think, compliance is viewed as a moment in time where we have either met, exceeded, or not met, or grossly unmet a particular standard. But how is that different to, a tick and flick competency assessment? If we're saying that competency should be the integration of all of these really important things in a person's practice, then why is it that it's a tick at a moment in time? If you think about the way that competency assessments are typically, not always, but going to say typically done, how is that different from compliance? And this is where you challenge me and tell me how it is different. We want someone to be competent all year round. We want them to be accountable and own their competence, because they're going to be competent and confident in some areas and lacking competence or confidence in other areas. But we want it to be this cyclical thing that is always present. But I think the way that it can sometimes happen in reality is like that compliance assessment where it's like, yep, you're now competent. You've done this, you've done that. Yep, we'll tick you off. You're now competent in those areas. So how should it be if that's what currently happens?
Yeah, I would say, Zoe, again, thinking like a system from there rather than, a static. So that dynamic interaction. So, I think from a maturity perspective, from health and learning from other industries, it is about, okay, you put all the car widgets in the right way, great from there. But what we're working in is a more dynamic environment. It's ever changing. The rate of knowledge and evidence that's being produced is phenomenal in the scheme of things. So competency cannot be considered a static measure because you have to stay contemporaneous with what's happening and best practice, etc. So bring us back to our conversation about mandatory training. So because you've completed the mandatory training, you're not competent. You're on your pathway to competence, and you may be considered at that moment in time, if I asked you some questions and assessed you, you may be able to demonstrate to me that you have competence in. But then as far as having a competent system or a workforce from there, it would be about how do we then integrate that into our, performance conversations? How do we get further evidence to support your ability to think and apply that knowledge or skill set in your practice? What is some feedback, like a bit of a 360? What is it that your patients or clients or peers are saying about your practice or what they've noticed about what you can do? So it takes it from being, an experiment or something that's in a contained environment to something that's in the context of the messiness of, the healthcare context.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I will disclaimer say my guru, who I've learned and love a lot about competency assessments, competency-based education, is Donna Wright. And that's one of the main things that she says is got to be contextual. But the other, when you mentioned, feedback, Karen, I think, again, referring to her, is that, she talks about, best practice in competency assessment is contextual to the environment, but verification. We need to actually be saying or showing evidence that the person is competent. But in doing that, you can demonstrate competence before even needing to do a competency assessment by verifying your competence. So, an example would be, why do I need to be assessed as being, competent in my communication skills if I've got evidence in the form of a card from patients that talk about, thank you for your excellent communication skills, thank you for looking after a family member at the end of life. Or I've got feedback from, a performance review where my manager has commented on my communication. If I've got those verification models that are methods in place that are contextual, why do I then need to be assessed as being competent, on a piece of paper? Michelle, you've got significant experience, particularly in the vet sector. I know you're busting to jump in with some thoughts on.
Oh, how dare you? No, I guess I was just thinking, what's my point of difference, or do I think of this differently? But I think
So do I want to challenge or do I want to agree?
What can I be bothered? Where does the burden here? Will I challenge or that's right. Where's the weight? But I think when I think about what I thought your question was originally, like, how do we look at competence? Is it a point in time? How do we ensure continued competence? You can have someone demonstrate their competence with all the principles of assessment and all the allowances and all the chance, and then find that the next day they do something that voided or invalidated what they had just demonstrated their competence for the day before. And that's a really difficult circumstance to be in, because then you're suddenly fronted with this concept of, did they just not give a damn? Is that why that they didn't do the same things? Were they overloaded with the load of the
human
heavy load? Are they human? What happened? And now
what's happening for them right now?
And now
what is wrong with them? Why can't they just do what they're meant to do?
Or was yesterday a fudge? Was yesterday a fudge and they didn't actually demonstrate competence? Now, I think the purists would argue that a true and accurate and principled competency assessment that someone demonstrated their competence of is never a fudge. It just can't be if it's been a well created and documented competency assessment. So how do you assure competence forever? I don't know. I think maybe you can't. I think you have to have a process in place. I think you have to systematize what you expect. I think you have to expect that there'll be flawed moments and hope, but also risk mitigate that those moments aren't high risk, high severity, high impact problems. That's probably, it's not a fail-proof scenario, but it is a well-tested, well-evidenced form to ensure we have the foundations of people doing the right thing in the best way for the right reason, with these elements of knowledge, skill, ability. And I think something I had thought maybe about saying earlier is I do love that element. I love those three elements of kind of knowledge, skills, and attributes, because I don't want someone to be able to perform the task well if they can't cognitively understand or process at a behavioural or attitude level. I worry that removes the critical thinking or analysis that if something happens here, like maybe they can demonstrate a beautiful way to clean a wound, dress a wound, and they've demonstrated competence. But let's say they're halfway through the wound dressing and the fire alarm goes off. So do they have the attitude or the cognitive ability to critically think about, what do I do now? We're about to evacuate and I don't have 7 more minutes to finish this dressing adequately or competently. So what is my choice here? Do I put on the old dressing pad and know that in 2 hours when we're back in, I'll start again? Do I put the new one on in a hurry? Do I stop cleaning in my due process? Do I leave it uncovered and just get the hell out of there, So I think, those elements are super important. They might not always happen, but they do happen. And I want to make sure that those three, knowledge, skill, and attitude, critical thinking, analysis, are embedded in the assessment process, so we can trust that as best as possible, as least risk as possible, these things are being carried out, these behaviours, skills, tasks are being carried out in the most competent fashion. Those are my thoughts, Zoe.
And I think, Zoe, you, in talking about the portfolio that you collect, like of patient letters or cards, etc., from there, or even reflections. So if we look at for those who are registered with APRA, completing your continuing professional development hours, part of that is supporting the philosophy that competence, that you need to continuously improve and continuously learn. It's not something that is, can just sit on and know that you're there. It is something to go from there. So I think that commitment to continuous professional development, the commitment to reflecting on your practice, and then thinking, as you were saying there, Michelle, about the why, the what and how to go about the why, what, and how in that space from there is really reflects probably the art and science that they say of health as well. And I think that, to me, brought together, Zoe, what you were saying about that portfolio, that there can be a clinical assessment, and clinical in that there's a logic to it, so it's quantifiable from there, and that's sort of from a science, cause and effect. And then the portfolio comes from the art side of it, which is around that sort of more dynamic and creative and responsive to the person and the environment side of things. So my bias would be, from a competency assessment, you do require those multimodal methods to get there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's when the critical thinking of the assessor or the educator or whoever's running the assessment comes in. We focus a lot on the learner or the clinician in that situation, but, identifying and matching what is my competency assessment and what's my method of verification or validation that the person is competent is where we as leaders need to integrate that in. So understanding, when might that written piece of evidence or a card from someone's portfolio or a reflection versus actual simulation or a direct observation, when would that method of verification be appropriate for the particular competency assessment? I think is critical. I want to ask one other question, because talking to our aged care friends and in the strength and standards, there's a clear change and need for competency-based education, which I know in the acute care space is something that's been very present for a long time. But what is competency-based education, and what's how is it different to just regular education or regular training?
Who are you asking?
Both. Jump in. Come at me.
Hatters, you're up.
Well, my first thought, unformed thought, is that it links to outcome-based. So I think that's the intention. So this is my interpretation from there, is that really from a competency-based, the thinking behind that is linked to being outcome-based. And so if we, use our program logic from there in thinking around that, the outcome we're looking for is, a reliable evidence-based practice. So that is happening from there. What are the things that we need to see to get there? And then from an educational design perspective, it's then around how do I design or prepare an experience for a learner that enables them to be able to be exposed to those different aspects, which would have a mix of, the knowledge, the clinical skill practice, and that behavioural components from there. So that's so it's less than just turning up. So if turning up to something and saying, okay, you've attended, we'll go back to mandatory training. You've attended, so we'll tick that box. You're now competent. From there to being, okay, you've read this. I can see you've read it because, you've replied or you've answered some quiz questions, etc. Now let's see you in the lab or see you in a supported practice environment and the parts from there. And now then let's see how we can over time see how these behaviors are becoming a habit in the way you do your practice. And that means I'm going to check in on you, and we'll, have some conversations over time to see how this is all evolving within your professional practice.
Agree. So competency-based education.
Outcome.
linked to an outcome. There is a demonstrated outcome commensurate with whatever competency you're teaching and assessing that demonstrates that the learner, the staff member, has gone from point A to point B and actually demonstrates an outcome. So if I think of the specific language in the standards, in the aged care standards, you must do competency-based education on core matters. So one of the core matters, let's say SIRS, serious incident reporting. So you would then attach an outcome of, your SIRS notifications, say pre-competency assessment or pre-training and then post, and then be able to, demonstrate that an outcome or a possible outcome as a result of undertaking this, and possibly with some other measures in place, is that we've got our notifications from here to there.
The bigger outcome is that, there's respect and dignity and safety and, because of being responsive and, being aware of the incident process and making sure that we learn and put interventions in place to maintain that over time. So I think having that sort of hierarchy of outcomes, but thinking from an educational outcome base, in saying that, well, there's an expectation of, what does competence look like in this context? That's the outcome we're looking for. But it's in that it's in service of that greater outcome.
The impact. Yeah. Michelle, you've got the last word.
I don't have a last word to that. I think Karen put it perfectly, beautifully. I don't have anything wiser to add to it, Zoe. So I'm out on that one.
Well, you're actually in. You're in to, I bet, even though it's only episode 3, that some of our listeners have already got a favourite part of the podcast, and that is Wiki's rant.
I think you're talking it up, but you ready? You ready?
Of pure, unfiltered.
Okay.
What's grinding your gears? Ready, set, go.
Such a build-up. Okay, it's competence-based. Just because you can give an injection doesn't mean you can assess an injection. So, look, I'm all for upskilling and delegation, but can we talk about the absolute circus of organisations letting any warm body with a uniform run competency assessments? It's giving, you've done this once, you must be qualified to assess it now. And that is BS. Assessing competence isn't just ticking boxes on a clipboard while someone fumbles through hand hygiene. It's regulated, it should be structured, it should be accountable, a process that's governed by the 4 principles of assessment. Now, I don't know all the intricacies of this, but what I do love is that it is fair, it is flexible, it is valid, and it is reliable. And if your assessor doesn't even know what those words mean, or that they don't know how to apply them to your process, then this is built on absolute rubbish. So you don't get to wave around a clipboard calling it competence or a competence assessment, or I've assessed you for competency just because Sandra in admin used to be a nurse and she knows how to wash hands. It's people's registration. It's patient's safety. It's career-based. Would you let someone assess your driving test just because they had driven once before? I don't think so. Maybe not your Uber driver, but maybe they do if they had 5 stars. The point is there are fundamentals to competency assessment, and I don't know why organisations aren't putting a small amount of money into this accessible process to make sure that it is exactly that: fair, flexible, valid, and reliable. If we know that our workforce needs to be founded on strong competence. End rant.
Love it. I agree, Michelle. I think, it is a hard question to answer. I hope our listeners have gotten some words of wisdom on what is competence. I think it is hard to answer. I think sometimes it's easier to say what it's not. And I think what it's not is, it's not a one-off. It's not something that you do every year or every second year or whatever interval your organisation sets at. It's living, it's breathing, it's part of our practice, it's ongoing. It's not a tick, it's not a task. It really is the foundation for good, safe, strong practice and strong teams that have the confidence to provide the safest possible care, or to speak up if something is not happening when it should be happening. So I think on that note, I'm going to quickly mention to our listeners, we are actually doing a webinar on this exact topic of competency assessment. I think people are sick of hearing from me. So in this webinar, we've got a panel where you will hear more from Michelle, more from Karen and Emma, our Learning Innovations lead, who has been working very hard and doing some wonderful stuff on competency. So we're going to unpack that more. We will make sure we pop the link to the recording and you can catch up. We'll also be publishing a range of thought leadership pieces, practical guides on the L&D toolbox. So make sure you head there if you've enjoyed this conversation and want to keep the brain juices going. The learning load not going to become a burden. I had to just sneak that in, Michelle.
You wait for my next rant, Zoe. You wait.
All on Zoe. So on that note, thank you. We'll wrap up today's episode. We'd love to hear from you listeners. If you've got a question, thoughts, feelings, concerns, feedback on today's episode, please drop us a line at podcast@ausmed.com.au. We look forward to our next episode. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Michelle.
Cheers.
Yeah.